The stained glass windows of St. Jude's Cathedral offered no warmth, only judgment. A bride stood alone at the altar, her veil dragging across the cold marble like a white flag of surrender. The groom had vanished. In his place walked the man who was supposed to kill him. Leo Rossi didn't come to rescue her. He came to claim a tactical advantage. He just didn't expect the pawn in a silk dress to look him in the eye and whisper the name only a dead woman knew. Dust motes danced in the heavy shafts of light piercing the cathedral's gloom. It was 40 minutes past the hour. The priest, a small man sweating profusely in his vestments, kept checking a gold pocket watch. The rhythmic snap of the watch casing, echoing off the vaulted ceilings, was the only sound cutting through the low, buzzing whispers of the 300 guests. Clara Hughes stood perfectly still at the altar. Her dress, 50 pounds of imported Italian silk and hand-sewn pearls, felt less like a gown and more like a tailored coffin. She did not fidget. She did not weep. She simply stared straight ahead at the ornate crucifix on the back wall, calculating. Victor Moretti was not coming. The realization didn't break her heart. Clara didn't love Victor. In their world, love was a liability that got people shot in alleys. Their marriage was supposed to be a treaty. The Hughes family controlled the docks. The Moretti family controlled the distribution. Clara was merely the ink on the contract. But Victor's absence meant more than public humiliation. It was a declaration. By leaving her at the altar, Victor was signaling to every capo, soldier, and politician in the pews that the treaty was dead. War was starting, and Clara was the first casualty. A heavy oak door at the back of the cathedral groaned open. The murmurs in the pews died instantly. 300 heads turned. Clara slowly pivoted, the heavy silk whispering against the stone floor. It wasn't Victor. The man walking down the center aisle moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. He wore a charcoal wool suit that absorbed the dim light, tailored perfectly over a frame built for violence, not boardrooms. Leo Rossi, head of the Rossi Syndicate. The man Victor Moretti had been trying to eradicate for 3 years. Leo didn't come alone. 4 men flanked him, their hands resting casually near their waistbands. The air in the church thickened. Men in the front pews, Moretti loyalists, slid their hands inside their jackets. Leather creaked. The metallic click of a safety being disengaged echoed from a dark corner. Leo didn't even turn his head. He just kept walking. His eyes, dark and flat as slate, were locked entirely on Clara. "Stay where you are," Leo's voice boomed, calm and resonant, carrying effortlessly to the back rows. The first man who pulls a piece in this church paints the walls with his own blood. No one moved. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Leo stopped at the foot of the altar steps. He looked at the sweating priest, then dismissed him with a fraction of a glance before returning his attention to the bride. Clara looked back. She didn't shrink away. She noted the faint white scar tracing his jawline, the exhaustion bruised into the skin under his eyes, the absolute absence of hesitation in his posture. "He's in a private jet halfway to Bogotá," Leo said. The words were delivered without malice, just cold facts. "He emptied the joint accounts this morning, left his capos to take the fall, left you to start the fire." Clara's jaw tightened. Victor always was a coward. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch affected the corner of Leo's mouth. Not quite a smile. He left a vacuum. By midnight, this city will be a war zone. My men will start killing his men. The Hughes family will be caught in the crossfire. You'll be dead by Friday, Clara. "Did you come to St. Jude's just to give me my eulogy, Mr. Rossi?" she asked. Her voice was steady, surprising them both. Leo stepped up onto the altar. He was close enough now that she could smell winter air and gun oil clinging to his coat. "I came to offer an amendment to the treaty," Leo said softly, his voice dropping so only she and the terrified priest could hear. Victor walked away. "The docks are still in play. Your father's territory is still vulnerable. The war happens, unless the ink dries on a different contract." Clara stared at him. The sheer audacity of it settled over her like a heavy blanket. "You want my docks?" "I want peace," Leo corrected, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm tired of burying my men because Victor Moretti throws temper tantrums. You marry me, right now, in front of his family. The Rossi and Hughes syndicates merge. The Moretti capos left behind will have to choose, fall in line or get crushed by our combined weight. A hostile takeover by matrimony." Clara looked out at the sea of faces. Some were pale, others looked murderous. If she walked down that aisle alone, she would be a target before she reached the street. She was an abandoned bride, worthless, unless she was Rossi's wife. "What do I get out of this?" she asked. "You get to live," Leo replied. "And you get to watch me dismantle every piece of the empire Victor thought he was coming back to." Clara turned back to the priest. The man was trembling, clutching his Bible as if it were a shield. "Skip the homily, Father," Clara said, her voice ringing out crisp and clear in the dead silent church. "Get to the vows." The rain began the moment they stepped out of the heavy wooden doors of St. Jude's. It was a freezing, torrential downpour that washed the grey streets of the city in a cold, unforgiving slick. Clara did not run for the idling black SUV. She walked. The hem of her $50,000 dress dragged through muddy puddles, soaking up the filthy water like a sponge. Leo walked beside her, matching her pace, an umbrella held over her head. He let the rain soak his own shoulders. It was a small, calculated courtesy. Neither spoke as they climbed into the cavernous back of the armored vehicle. The doors slammed shut with a heavy, vault-like thud, instantly cutting off the sound of the storm and the chaotic shouting of reporters who had just caught wind of the spectacle inside. The SUV pulled away. Inside, the air was climate-controlled, smelling of rich leather and the scotch sitting in a crystal decanter between the seats. Leo poured a glass, 2 fingers. Neat. He held it out to her. Clara looked at the amber liquid, then at his hand. Large. Calloused. A faint smudge of ink on his index finger. She took the glass, the crystal cold against her skin, but she didn't drink. She simply rested it on her lap, letting the weight of it anchor her trembling hands. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a hollow, icy dread. "You did well in there," Leo said. He poured himself a glass and leaned back against the headrest, staring out the tinted, bulletproof window at the blurred city lights. Most women would have panicked, screamed, begged. "Begging requires an audience that cares," Clara replied, keeping her gaze fixed on the partition separating them from the driver. "My father sold me to Victor to keep the shipping lanes open. You bought me to close them. There's nothing to cry about. It's just business." Leo finally turned to look at her. The streetlights, strobing through the rain-streaked windows, cast shifting shadows across his face, making him look older, more dangerous. "You think I bought you? Didn't you? I offered you a shield. A shield made of crosshairs," she shot back, her cynical facade cracking just a fraction. "Half the men in that church are going to try to kill you by morning. The other half are going to try to kill me, to punish you." "They will try," Leo agreed smoothly. He took a sip of his scotch. "They will fail. You are Rossi now. No one touches what belongs to my family." What belongs to my family? She was property. Upgraded property, perhaps, but property nonetheless. The drive to the Rossi compound took an hour. The iron gates parted like the jaws of a beast, swallowing the SUV into a sprawling estate surrounded by high stone walls and patrolmen with rifles slung over their shoulders. The house itself was a fortress of limestone and dark glass, imposing and devoid of warmth. Leo led her inside. The foyer was vast, echoing with the sound of his heavy shoes and the wet squelch of her ruined dress. He didn't offer her a tour. He led her straight down a long corridor and pushed open a set of heavy mahogany doors to his office. It was a masculine room. Bookshelves lined with ledgers and thick volumes, a massive oak desk, and the faint, lingering scent of cigar smoke. "There are guest rooms on the east wing," Leo said, walking behind the desk. He didn't sit. He began unbuttoning his suit jacket. "My housekeeper will show you. You have full run of the house, except for the basement. Don't go down there. Don't leave the grounds without my security detail. We will make public appearances when necessary to solidify the narrative. Otherwise, we live separate lives." Clara stood in the center of the Persian rug. The wet silk clung freezing to her legs. She felt ridiculously out of place, a ruined porcelain doll in a room built for warfare. He was laying out the terms: cold, clean, transactional. But Clara hadn't survived 24 years in a Mafia family by being a passive piece on the board. If she was going to be a prisoner in this fortress, she needed to know the warden wasn't made of stone. She needed leverage. She set the untouched glass of scotch down on a side table. She walked slowly toward the desk. Leo stopped unbuttoning his jacket. His eyes tracked her, a predator assessing a sudden, unexpected movement from its prey. Clara stopped just on the other side of the oak desk. She looked at him. Really looked at him. She bypassed the hardened exterior, the cold eyes, the reputation of the ruthless Rossi boss. She reached back into the memories of a time before the syndicates drew their bloody borders. A time when she was just a little girl sneaking out of boring syndicate galas, and he was a teenage boy hiding in the gardens, bleeding from a fight his father had provoked. She leaned forward slightly. The room was dead silent, the rain beating violently against the reinforced glass behind him. "We won't live separate lives," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a razor. Leo's jaw tightened. "Excuse me." Clara held his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to let him retreat behind the mask of the boss. "I know why you really bought me," she whispered. She watched his chest stop moving, watched the breath catch in his throat. "Gabriel." The silence that followed was absolute. Leo Rossi did not flinch. He did not step back, but the color drained from his face, leaving him pale and terrifyingly still. The glass decanter on his desk seemed to vibrate from the sudden, immense tension in the room. Gabriel. A name buried under 2 decades of blood, concrete, and lies. A name belonging to a boy who supposedly died in a fire 20 years ago. Leo's hands slowly flattened on the surface of the desk. The cold, transactional boss was gone. In his place was something entirely unpredictable and wildly dangerous. "Where?" Leo breathed, the word vibrating with a low, lethal threat. "Did you hear that name?" The air in the office turned to ice. Leo moved around the oak desk with a sudden, fluid speed that belied his massive frame. His hand clamped around Clara's upper arm, gripping the wet silk of her ruined dress. The pressure was firm, a hair's breadth from bruising, but it wasn't a strike. It was absolute restraint. "Who told you that name?" Leo asked again. The smooth, transactional mob boss was entirely gone. The man standing before her now was the desperate street kid who had clawed his way out of the gutter with blood on his knuckles. Clara did not pull away. The chill of her soaked dress seeped into her bones. but the adrenaline rushing through her veins burned hot enough to counter it. "Victor told me," Clara lied smoothly. A necessary fiction. Victor was far too arrogant and far too stupid to uncover a ghost. Clara had found the discrepancy herself, buried deep in her father's old shipping manifests from 2 decades ago. A boy smuggled out of the city in a shipping container bound for Europe. The manifest bore a single initial, G. Rossi. Leo's grip tightened a fraction. His dark eyes searched hers, looking for the telltale micro-expressions of a bluff. Victor is an idiot. He couldn't find his own gun in an empty room, let alone dig up a 20-year-old corpse. "Victor had his father's archives," Clara countered, keeping her voice remarkably level. "Old ledgers, blackmail material, things the previous generation kept as insurance policies against each other. The fire at the Rossi estate 20 years ago. It didn't claim everyone, did it, Leo?" Leo slowly let go of her arm. He stepped back, running a heavy hand over his face. The white scar on his jaw seemed to glow against his suddenly pale skin. He turned his back to her, staring out the reinforced glass at the relentless, driving rain. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Clara stood her ground, dripping rainwater onto the expensive Persian rug. This was the ultimate gamble. If she pushed too hard, she became a threat to the syndicate. If she backed down, she remained a hostage in a gilded cage. Gabriel was 4 years old. Leo finally spoke, his voice stripped of all its usual booming resonance. "My father ordered a hit on a rival boss. The rival retaliated. They firebombed the east wing of our house in the middle of the night. The official police report stated my mother and brother burned in their beds. But he didn't. No." Leo turned his head slightly, catching her reflection in the dark glass. "My mother dragged him out through a collapsed servant's passage. She died of smoke inhalation on the lawn. I was 10 years old. I found them. I knew if the men who set the fire found out the boy lived, they would finish the job. The hospital would have been a slaughterhouse. So I hid him. I paid a dock worker everything I had in my pockets to put him on a freighter." Clara felt a sharp, cold knot tighten in her chest. The dock worker. Her father. Thomas Hughes had taken a terrified 10-year-old's money, stamped the manifest, and sent a 4-year-old child into the abyss of the Atlantic. You shipped your own brother away. I kept him alive. Leo turned around, his eyes locking onto hers with a ferocity that made her breath hitch. "For 20 years the world thought Gabriel Rossi was ash, and now you walk into my office, wearing a ruined wedding dress, and use his name as a bargaining chip." Clara lifted her chin. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a strange, hyper-focused calm. "I didn't use it as a chip, Leo. I used it as a key." "To what?" "To you." Clara stepped closer, intentionally closing the physical distance he had created. "You brought me here to use me as a shield against Victor's loyalists. You think I'm just a pampered Mafia princess who got left at the altar. But I know things. I know the shipping routes. I know the union bosses. And I know my father kept strict tabs on the freighter that took your brother." Leo went utterly still. "Your father is dead, but his private files aren't." Clara held his stare, refusing to blink, refusing to show fear. "Victor didn't find the file, Leo. I did. I know exactly where the ship landed. I know the name of the orphanage that took the boy." The silence that followed was absolute. Leo did not move. He did not breathe. The hardened mob boss, the man who ordered executions without a second thought, was standing paralyzed in front of an abandoned bride. "If you are lying to me, Clara." "I'm not." "Why tell me this now? Why not at the church?" "Because now we are married." Clara's voice was devoid of romance, filled entirely with cold, undeniable logic. You want my docs to stop a street war? Fine. But I am not going to be a silent prisoner in this house while you fight it. We operate as partners. You bring me to the table. You listen to my counsel regarding the Port Authority. In exchange, I give you the file." Leo stared at her. The rain battered the windows, a chaotic symphony behind the tense standoff. He was calculating the risk, weighing the absolute truth in her eyes against the decades of deception he had endured to keep his throne. "Partners," Leo murmured, testing the word on his tongue. It sounded foreign. It tasted like ash and iron. "Partners," Clara confirmed. Leo walked slowly back to his desk. He picked up the crystal decanter, poured a generous measure of scotch into a fresh glass, and held it out to her. "Drink it," Leo commanded, his tone shifting back to the authoritative boss, but with a new, distinct edge of respect. "You're freezing." Clara took the glass. The amber liquid burned, going down, settling like a warm coal in her empty stomach. "My housekeeper's name is Martha," Leo said, turning his gaze back to the storm outside. "She will draw you a hot bath. Tomorrow morning, we meet in this office at 8. We review the Port Authority contracts. And then you show me the file." Clara turned toward the heavy mahogany doors. The gamble had paid off. She wasn't just a tactical shield anymore. She was holding the one thing Leo Rossi valued more than his entire empire. Sunlight did not penetrate the gloom of the Rossi estate the following morning. Thick, slate-grey clouds hung low over the city, threatening another deluge. Inside the fortress, the atmosphere was equally oppressive. The war had officially begun before dawn. Clara descended the main staircase precisely at 8 o'clock. Martha, a stoic woman with iron-grey hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing, had provided a tailored charcoal suit, likely a remnant from a female associate, but it fit reasonably well. The soaking wedding dress was gone, perhaps burned or thrown in the trash. Clara didn't ask, and Martha didn't offer. Heavy voices echoed from the open doors of Leo's office. Men were arguing loudly. The distinct scent of strong black coffee and stale cigarette smoke spilled into the pristine hallway. Clara paused at the threshold. Inside, 5 men stood clustered around the massive oak desk, which was now littered with city maps and architectural blueprints. Leo stood at the head of the table. His suit jacket was discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with dense muscle and faded ink. He looked like he hadn't slept a single minute. "They hit the warehouse on 5th and Main at 4 this morning," a burly man with a severely broken nose was saying, jabbing a thick finger at a red circle on the map. "Burned 2 delivery trucks, shot Jimmy in the knee. The Moretti remnants aren't backing down, boss. They're trying to prove a point." "They are proving they lack basic imagination," Leo replied flatly, tracing a line on the blueprint. "Hitting a logistics hub is a rookie move. We need to choke their cash flow, not trade bullets in the street like common thugs." "Their cash is tied up in the offshore accounts Victor left behind," another capo muttered, scratching his jaw. "We can't touch it. The feds are already sniffing around the banks." "Not all of it," a clear, authoritative voice interrupted. Every head snapped toward the doorway. Clara stood there, hands clasped loosely in front of her, projecting a calm she did not entirely feel. The capos stared at her with a mixture of shock and blatant hostility. A woman, and worse, Thomas Hughes's daughter, had absolutely no place in a syndicate war council. Leo did not look surprised. He simply nodded toward an empty leather chair near the edge of the desk. "Come in, Clara." The broken-nosed man scowled deeply. "Boss, with all due respect, this ain't a place for the wife." "The wife owns the docks," Leo countered smoothly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. And the docks are exactly how the Moretti loyalists are smuggling their product out of the city to generate quick cash. Sit down, Paulie. Paulie snapped his mouth shut and stepped back, his dark eyes glaring daggers at Clara. Clara ignored him entirely. She walked into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She approached the desk, leaning over slightly to inspect the scattered maps. "Victor emptied the joint accounts before he got on that plane," Clara said, addressing the room but looking only at Leo. "But he couldn't liquidate the physical assets fast enough. The Moretti crew has 3 massive shipments of electronics sitting in customs at Pier 42. They are waiting for the bribe money to clear so they can move it to the black market." Paulie crossed his massive arms. "How the hell do you know that?" "Because my father's people handle the customs inspectors," Clara stated, turning her icy gaze to the capo. Victor thought he was being clever, using dummy corporations to hide the trail. But the manifest codes match the Hughes internal tracking system perfectly. The shipment is worth roughly $4 million. Silence descended on the office. $4 million was enough cash to fund a brutal street war for months. If the Rossi syndicate seized it, the Moretti loyalists would starve within a week. Leo leaned forward, resting his palms flat on the desk. "Can you freeze the shipment?" "Freezing it requires a digital paper trail," Clara explained, tapping Pier 42 on the map. "We don't freeze it. We reroute it entirely. I can make a single phone call to the dockmaster. The containers get loaded onto a truck bound for a Rossi warehouse instead of a Moretti safe house. By the time they realize the cargo is gone, we've already fenced it." The capos exchanged uneasy, calculating glances. The plan was incredibly elegant. It required 0 bullets, risked no men, and dealt a crippling financial blow. But it relied entirely on trusting the daughter of their former enemy. "Do it," Leo ordered. Paulie opened his mouth to protest, but Leo raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. "Make the call, Clara." Clara picked up the heavy landline phone from the desk. She dialed a number from memory, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The room watched in tense silence as she spoke briefly, dropped a few specific coded phrases, and hung up. "It's done," Clara announced. "The trucks will be at your warehouse in Queens by noon." Leo stared at her for a long moment. There was no affection in his gaze, only a profound, calculating assessment. She had just proven her worth. She had just bought her seat at the table with cold, hard currency. "Clear the room," Leo instructed quietly. The capos hesitated, then filed out, casting suspicious looks at Clara as they passed. Paulie was the last to leave, shutting the heavy mahogany doors behind him with a definitive, echoing thud. The office was suddenly completely quiet, save for the low hum of the HVAC unit. Leo walked slowly around the desk, his imposing frame blocking the meager grey light from the window. "You delivered on the docks," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I told you I was a partner. Now deliver on the file." Clara reached into the inside pocket of the oversized charcoal jacket. She retrieved a thin, folded manila envelope. It was old, the edges frayed and yellowed with age. She held it out. Leo stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. His hand, usually so steady holding a weapon, trembled fractionally as he took it. He didn't open it immediately. He just held it, feeling the immense weight of 20 years of grief and guilt compressed into a few fragile sheets of paper. "My father tracked the freighter to a port in Marseille," Clara said softly, watching the conflict rage behind his slate-grey eyes. The boy was handed off to a local Catholic orphanage. The file contains the name of the facility, the exact intake date, and the priest who signed the paperwork. Leo slowly opened the flap. He pulled out a single, brittle sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the typewritten lines. The silence stretched, thick and agonizing. Clara watched watched the ruthless Mafia boss fracture. The rigid line of his broad shoulders dropped. The air seemed to rush out of his lungs in a ragged, silent exhale. He closed his eyes, his thumb tracing the faded blue ink of a signature at the bottom of the page. "St. Jerome's," Leo whispered to the empty room. "We can send someone," Clara offered cautiously. "A private investigator. Someone highly discreet." Leo opened his eyes. The vulnerability was instantly gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. The ruthless boss was back in the driver's seat. "No," Leo said, carefully folding the paper and placing it into his inner breast pocket. "We don't send anyone. The moment people start asking questions about a Rossi in Marseille, the Moretti loyalists will find out. They will use him against me." "So what do we do?" Leo looked at her, his expression utterly unreadable. "We win this war first. We crush every last piece of Victor's empire until there is no one left to threaten my family." He stepped closer, the scent of coffee and danger rolling off him. "And then, Clara, you and I are going to France." Blood dripped steadily onto the antique Persian rug, soaking into the intricate crimson threads. It was 3 weeks into the war. The city was suffocating under a blanket of paranoia, and the Rossi estate had transformed from a fortress into a command bunker. Leo sat on the edge of the heavy oak desk. His white dress shirt was plastered to his left side, saturated with a dark, wet stain. He wasn't groaning. He was just breathing through his teeth, a harsh, rhythmic hiss that cut through the silence of the office. Martha usually handled the medical kits, but Martha was asleep in the West Wing, completely unaware of the violent conclusion to the midnight meet at the rail yards. Clara stood, holding a bottle of medical-grade iodine and a pair of surgical shears. She didn't scream when he had stumbled through the mahogany doors 5 minutes ago. Growing up with Thomas Hughes meant she had seen bullet wounds before she was old enough to drive. "Cut the shirt," Leo rasped, his head tipped back against the desk lamp. "Don't try to pull it over my head. The fabric is fused to the entry point." Clara stepped between his parted knees. The proximity was strictly necessary, but the sudden blast of his body heat in the freezing office made her pulse spike. She slid the cold metal of the shears against his skin and cut upward. The expensive cotton gave way with a sharp, tearing sound. She peeled the ruined shirt back, exposing the heavy slabs of muscle across his chest and the angry, bubbling gash just below his ribs. "A graze," Clara noted, her voice steady. She uncapped the iodine. "A very deep graze. But the bullet didn't lodge. You got lucky, Rossi." "Luck is a myth," Leo muttered, his eyes heavy and dark. It was poorly. The Moretti shooters had a crossfire set up behind the shipping crates. Paulie spotted the glare of a rifle scope and shoved me into the dirt, took a ricochet to his shoulder for his trouble. Clara poured the iodine directly onto a gauze pad. "This is going to burn." She didn't wait for him to brace himself. She pressed the soaked gauze hard against the open wound. Leo's entire body went rigid. The cords in his neck stood out like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. His hands clamped onto the edge of the desk, knuckles white, the wood groaning under his grip. Clara kept the pressure firm, her face inches from his chest. She could smell cordite, sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. The war was supposed to be clinical, a strangulation of assets. Over the last 21 days, Clara had dismantled the Moretti supply lines with the precision of a surgeon. She froze accounts, rerouted shipments, and starved their loyalists of cash. But cornered animals do not surrender. They bite. Tonight was proof that logistics could only protect them so far. "You're shaking," Leo said quietly. The sharp pain seemed to have grounded him. Clara lifted the gauze, inspecting the cleaned wound. "I'm freezing. Your office feels like a meat locker. You're lying. She reached for the surgical tape. I'm calculating. If that sniper had been 2 inches to the right, I would be a widow. Again. Only this time, I wouldn't have a Rossi army to protect me from the fallout. Leo watched her hands work. Swift, efficient, completely devoid of the trembling that usually accompanied civilians in the presence of a gunshot wound. You aren't just a shield anymore, Clara. The men know what you've done with the shipping routes. Even Paulie stopped calling you the wife. They call you the architect. A title won't stop a bullet. Clara secured the thick bandage over his ribs. She stepped back, dropping the bloodied shears into a plastic basin. You need to rest. The bleeding has stopped, but you've lost more than you should. Leo didn't move. He remained seated on the edge of the desk, his bare chest rising and falling slowly. The vulnerability in his posture was jarring. The ruthless boss of the Rossi syndicate looked entirely hollowed out. They hit a civilian tonight, Leo said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. A night watchman at the rail yard. He just walked out of the booth to check a broken lock. The Moretti triggerman panicked and put 2 in his chest. Clara froze, her hands gripping the edge of the basin. The Mafia had rules. Collateral damage was bad for business. It drew the feds, it drew the media, and it broke the fragile social contract they held with the city. Victor's capos are losing control of their soldiers, Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. They know they're starving. They want this over. It ends tomorrow. Leo finally pushed himself off the desk. He winced, his hand instinctively ghosting over his bandaged side. He towered over her in the dim light. We located the Moretti safe house. The remaining capos are meeting at an abandoned meatpacking plant on the south side at dawn to pool their last resources. Clara looked up at him. You're going to wipe them out? I am going to amputate a rotting limb. Leo reached out, his calloused thumb lightly brushing a stray lock of hair away from her face. It was the first time he had touched her without a tactical reason. The contact sent a jolt of static straight down her spine. Once it's done, the city is ours. And then, we book a flight to Marseille. The siren ripped through the estate at 2 in the morning. It wasn't a standard security alarm. It was a deep, guttural klaxon that vibrated the floorboards and rattled the windows in their reinforced frames. Clara bolted upright in her bed in the east wing. The darkness of her room was instantly fractured by the strobing red glare of emergency lights mounted in the courtyard. Gunfire erupted. Not the distant, hollow pop of a street skirmish, but the deafening, rapid-fire roar of automatic weapons right outside the heavy limestone walls. The heavy oak door of her bedroom crashed open. Leo stood in the frame, holding a suppressed tactical rifle. He was still wearing the slacks from earlier, his chest bare, the white bandage stark against his skin. "Move!" Leo barked, crossing the room in 3 massive strides. Clara didn't ask questions. She threw off the heavy duvet and grabbed the thick wool robe draped over the armchair. She was shoving her arms into the sleeves when a localized explosion shook the foundation of the house. Plaster rained down from the ceiling. "They brought explosives?" Clara yelled over the ringing in her ears. "A suicide play," Leo grimaced, grabbing her upper arm and hauling her into the hallway. "They know the supply lines are dead. They spent their last dimes on a mercenary crew to breach the gates. Paulie has the front lawn locked down, but they breached the west wall. The sprawling corridors of the Rossi estate were a chaotic blur of running men, shouting voices, and the acrid smell of burning sulfur. Leo didn't lead her toward the heavy reinforced front doors. He dragged her toward the kitchen, toward the restricted service corridor. "Where are we going?" she demanded, struggling to keep pace with his long, urgent strides. "The basement." Clara stumbled. "You explicitly forbade me from going down there." "Plans change. They reached the end of the narrow corridor. A heavy steel door, resembling a bank vault, was embedded directly into the reinforced concrete foundation. Leo rapidly punched a 12-digit code into the digital keypad. The heavy locking mechanisms clanked loudly, and the door hissed open. He shoved her inside and followed, slamming his hand against a red button on the wall. The steel door closed with a sickening, definitive thud, instantly severing the sounds of the battle raging above. The silence in the room was absolute, pressing against Clara's eardrums. Bright fluorescent lights flickered on, illuminating the space. Clara turned around, expecting to see a sterile panic room or an armory. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. It was an archive. The basement was massive, lined wall to wall with filing cabinets, corkboards, and towering stacks of banker boxes. The walls were plastered with maps of Europe. Red string connected shipping ports to orphanages, church parishes, and unmarked graves across 3 different countries. Thousands of photographs of young men, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, were pinned to the corkboards. It wasn't a dungeon. It was a monument to a ghost. "You never stopped looking," Clara whispered, walking slowly toward the nearest map. The sheer volume of data, the thousands of hours of obsessive tracking, was staggering. Leo leaned his rifle against the steel door. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline failing to mask the toll of his fresh injury. "For 20 years I tore apart every port city in Europe. I bribed dock workers, threatened priests, bought off local police chiefs. Every lead was a dead end. Every kid with dark hair and a scar was a false hope." Clara traced a red line that ended abruptly in Naples. The brutal, calculating mob boss was a facade. This room was the reality. He was a man consumed by the guilt of putting a 4-year-old on a boat and losing him to the world. She turned to face him. He was watching her, waiting for the judgment, waiting for her to use this profound vulnerability against him. "Why didn't you tell me this is what was down here?" Clara asked softly. "Because in this business, obsession is a weakness," Leo said, his voice flat. He walked over to the metal table and pulled a bottle of water from a small cooler, tossing it to her. "If Victor knew I spent half the syndicate's resources chasing a ghost, he would have exploited it years ago." "No one knows this room exists. Not even Paulie." Clara caught the bottle. The cold plastic grounded her. "But I know. You brought me the missing piece, Clara." Leo stepped closer, his imposing frame suddenly feeling less like a threat and more like a shelter. "You found St. Jerome's. You did in 3 days what I couldn't do in 2 decades. Above them, a muffled thud vibrated the ceiling. The fight was still raging, but muffled by 2 feet of solid concrete. Down here, they were completely isolated from the violent world they both ruled. "We are partners," Clara said, the word feeling different this time. It wasn't a business arrangement anymore. Leo stopped inches from her. His dark eyes searched her face, mapping the sharp angles of her jaw, the defiance in her posture. The tension that had been coiling between them since the altar finally snapped. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in her hair, pulling her forward. Clara dropped the water bottle. It hit the concrete floor with a hollow clatter, completely ignored. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate collision of adrenaline, fear, and 20 days of repressed restraint. Leo kissed her like a man drowning, and Clara answered with the exact same ferocity. She fisted her hands into the lapels of his discarded robe, pulling him impossibly closer, anchoring herself to the only real thing in a world built on lies. Gunfire still rattled the floorboards above, but the sound was distant, entirely eclipsed by the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere of the concrete bunker. Leo broke the kiss just enough to breathe, his forehead resting heavily against Clara's. His hands remained anchored in her hair, gripping her as if she were the only tether keeping him from drifting into the abyss. The cold, calculating boss was completely dismantled. The man standing in the stark fluorescent light of the archive was bleeding, exhausted, and desperately human. Clara kept her hands fisted in his lapels, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the chaos echoing through the ceiling. This was not a tactical maneuver. This was a collision, a surrender to the suffocating tension that had built between them since the moment he walked down the aisle at St. Jude's. "You should be terrified of me," Leo murmured, his voice a rough scrape of gravel. He didn't open his eyes. "I am terrified of a lot of things, Rossi," Clara replied, her breathing jagged. "You aren't on the list." Leo finally opened his eyes. The slate-grey depths were entirely focused on her, stripping away the final layers of the cynical armor she wore. He ran his thumb along her jawline, a gentle, deliberate contrast to the brutal violence occurring just 50 feet above their heads. A sharp burst of static hissed from a heavy, black radio, mounted on the concrete wall near the vault door. "Boss!" Paulie's voice crackled through the speaker, distorted and out of breath. "We neutralized the breach. 4 casualties on our side. The mercenary crew is wiped out. The perimeter is secure, but the West Wing is a total loss. They brought thermite." Leo's posture shifted instantly. The vulnerable man vanished, swallowed whole by the syndicate boss. He released Clara, stepping back and running a hand over his face. He walked over to the radio, pressing the heavy metal button on the side. "Understood," Leo said, his voice dropping back to its usual authoritative baritone. "Rally the surviving men in the courtyard. Secure the gate. Do not let the fire department inside the walls until we have scrubbed the grounds." Clara smoothed down the front of her robe, forcing her heart rate to slow. The brief, intense pocket of isolation was over. The war had intruded again. Leo turned back to her, picking up his tactical rifle from where it leaned against the heavy steel door. "We need to go up. The men need to see me walking. If they think I'm badly wounded, panic sets in." "I am coming with she," Clara said, stepping toward him. "No." Leo shook his head firmly. "The courtyard is a slaughterhouse. You stay down here until Paulie clears the interior." Clara didn't back down. She crossed her arms, her chin lifting in a familiar gesture of defiance. "I am the architect of this war, Leo. I froze their money. I rerouted their shipments. The men already know I am not a civilian. If I hide in a bunker while you walk the ashes of your own home, I lose the respect I just bought." Leo stared at her. A faint, grim smile ghosted across his face. He recognized the iron in her spine, the exact same iron that allowed her to stand utterly still at an empty altar. "Stay behind me," he instructed, turning toward the heavy vault door. "And don't look down." He punched the code into the keypad. The heavy locks disengaged with a series of metallic clanks, and the door swung open, welcoming the sharp, acrid stench of burning wood and copper. The corridor leading to the kitchen was unrecognizable. The drywall was entirely blown out, exposing the jagged wooden framing and severed electrical wires sparking against the wet stone floor. The fire suppression system had triggered, raining cold, dirty water down on the debris. They moved quickly through the ruined house. The West Wing was completely engulfed in smoke, the orange glow of flames licking at the night sky through a massive, jagged hole in the limestone wall. When they stepped out the front doors and onto the courtyard, the reality of the violence hit Clara like a physical blow. The pristine gravel driveway was cratered. 2 armored SUVs were completely engulfed in flames, casting long, wavering shadows across the lawn. Bodies, clad in dark tactical gear, lay scattered across the manicured grass. Paulie stood near the twisted remnants of the iron gates, his left arm bound tightly to his chest with a blood-soaked tourniquet. The surviving Rossi soldiers turned to look at the front steps. They saw their boss, bleeding but standing tall, his rifle gripped loosely in his right hand. And right beside him, completely unflinching in the face of the carnage, stood the daughter of Thomas Hughes. "Paulie!" Leo called out, his voice booming over the crackle of the burning vehicles. "Get a perimeter established. Load the wounded into the remaining vans. Send them to the underground clinic." Paulie nodded sharply, barking orders at the surviving men. The chaotic courtyard immediately shifted into a state of hyper-organized triage. The men moved with a renewed, grim purpose. Their boss was alive. The war wasn't over. Leo turned to Clara. The orange firelight danced across his hardened features. Victor's capos sent everything they had left to this gate tonight. They missed, which means they are entirely defenseless, Clara noted, her mind already shifting to the logistics of a counterstrike. The meatpacking plant? Exactly, Leo agreed, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. They are sitting in that abandoned factory right now, waiting for a radio call from this mercenary crew to tell them I am dead. Clara looked at the destruction around them, at the blood soaking into the gravel. "So we go deliver the news ourselves." Dawn broke over the city in a bruised, sullen haze. The industrial district on the south side was a wasteland of rusted chain-link fences, cracked concrete, and massive, silent brick structures that had been abandoned decades ago. A convoy of 4 unmarked black SUVs rolled down the empty avenue, cutting their headlights a block away from the abandoned meatpacking plant. The vehicles glided to a halt in the shadows of a crumbling overpass. Inside the lead vehicle, the air was thick with the smell of gun oil and stale coffee. Leo sat in the front passenger seat, checking the magazine of his sidearm. He had changed into a fresh black tactical sweater, the thick wool hiding the fresh bandages binding his ribs. Clara sat in the back, a glowing laptop balanced on her knees. She was connected directly to the city's traffic grid. "I have the intersection cameras looped," Clara announced, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "For the next 45 minutes, dispatch sees an empty street. I also rerouted a noise complaint to a warehouse 3 miles east of here. The police will be busy chasing ghosts." Paulie, sitting in the driver's seat, with one arm firmly strapped in a sling, glanced in the rear-view mirror. "You actually know how to run interference. The Hughes family wasted you on shipping manifests." "My father valued obedience over competence," Clara replied flatly, keeping her eyes on the screen. "A mistake I don't intend to repeat." Leo racked the slide of his pistol and holstered it. He turned to look at Clara over the center console. "You stay in the vehicle. The plant has one primary exit and a loading dock in the back. If anyone makes it out, Paulie drives you out of here immediately. Do not hesitate. Just finish the job, Rossi," Clara said, meeting his intense gaze. "We have a flight to catch." Leo gave a single sharp nod. He opened the door and stepped out into the freezing morning air. 10 Rossi soldiers filed out of the other vehicles, moving with terrifying silence. They were the elite crew, the men who had survived the night siege and were hungry for blood. Leo communicated entirely with hand signals, dividing the men into 2 teams. One team circled toward the rear loading dock. Leo led the second team straight toward the heavy steel front doors of the plant. Clara watched through the tinted window as Leo approached the entrance. He didn't bother picking the lock. He planted a breaching charge, stepped back, and hit the detonator. The explosion was dull, a heavy thump that rattled the windows of the SUV. The steel doors blew completely off their hinges, folding inward in a cloud of brick dust and smoke. Leo walked into the smoke before it even cleared, his weapon raised. His men flooded in behind him. The silence that followed was excruciating. Inside the plant, the air was frigid, smelling of old rust and dried blood. The Moretti loyalists had set up their command center on the main butchering floor. surrounded by heavy steel meat hooks hanging from rusted overhead tracks. They were completely caught off guard. The breach happened so fast, half of the capos didn't even have time to reach for their weapons. Leo moved through the room with a cold, mechanical precision. He fired 3 times, putting down the men who managed to draw steel. The echoing cracks of the pistol shots bounced violently off the tile walls. The remaining 5 Moretti loyalists dropped to their knees, their hands raised, their faces pale with absolute terror. Leo lowered his weapon slightly. He walked slowly across the blood-stained tile floor, his heavy boots crushing shards of broken glass. He stopped in front of the oldest man in the group, Salvatore, Victor's right-hand man. Salvatore was trembling violently. "Leo, wait. We can make a deal. We can turn the remaining territory over to you." "You breached my home," Leo stated. His voice wasn't angry. It was completely devoid of emotion, a void that was far more terrifying than rage. "You terrorized my men. You burned my property." "It was a last resort," Salvatore pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the freezing temperature. "Victor left us to die. We were starving. We had to try." "Victor made you weak," Leo corrected, stepping closer. "But you chose to be stupid. You sent mercenaries to kill my wife." Salvatore's eyes widened in realization. The treaty, the abandoned bride. They had underestimated the merger. They thought Clara was just a pawn. They didn't realize she had become the queen on the board. "The war is over, Sal," Leo said quietly. He didn't pull the trigger. He simply stepped back and nodded to his men. Leo turned and walked back toward the blown-out entrance, leaving the butchering floor behind. The heavy, suppressed thumps of automatic weapons echoed through the cavernous building as he stepped out into the grey morning light. The air outside felt incredibly clean. Leo walked back to the command SUV and pulled open the heavy door. He slid into the passenger seat, closing the door with a solid thud. He holstered his weapon and let out a long, ragged exhale, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede. Clara closed the laptop. She looked at him, taking in the dust on his boots and the cold, flat exhaustion in his eyes. She didn't ask what happened inside. She already knew. The Moretti syndicate was entirely erased from the map. "Poorly," Leo said, leaning his head back against the leather headrest and closing his eyes. "Yeah, boss?" "Contact the airfield." Leo's voice was exhausted, but a new, distinct undercurrent of hope hummed beneath the words. "Tell the pilot to prep the jet. We are leaving for Marseille." The flight across the Atlantic was a suspended state of limbo. Inside the cabin of the private jet, the air was still and quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute carnage they had left behind. Leo slept for the first 5 hours, a deep, restorative crash brought on by blood loss and adrenaline depletion. Clara did not sleep. She sat across from him in the plush leather seat, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest beneath his fresh shirt. Marseille smelled of sea salt, baking bread, and diesel exhaust. The Mediterranean sun was blinding, casting harsh, bright shadows over the ancient cobblestone streets. It felt like an entirely different planet compared to the bleak, blood-stained concrete of their home city. Leo rented a discreet black Peugeot. He drove in silence, navigating the winding, narrow roads, climbing away from the bustling port. The tension radiating from him was palpable, a tightly coiled spring threatening to snap. Clara sat in the passenger seat, tracing the route on a physical map. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She simply provided directions. St. Jerome sat on a rocky bluff overlooking the sea. It was a sprawling, weathered stone compound with terracotta roof tiles and heavy oak doors that looked as though they had survived centuries of coastal storms. They walked through the arched entrance into a quiet, shaded courtyard. The air was cool here, smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine. An elderly priest in a simple black cassock was sweeping the stone path. He stopped as they approached, his faded blue eyes assessing the two strangers in expensive, dark clothes. "May I help you?" the priest asked in accented English, leaning on his broom. Leo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the brittle, yellowed intake form Clara had given him. He handed it to the priest. His hand was perfectly steady, but Clara could see a muscle jumping erratically in his jaw. "I am looking for information on a boy," Leo said, his voice stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "He was brought here 20 years ago. The name on the manifest was Gabriel." The priest carefully unfolded the paper. He read the faded type, then looked up at Leo. The old man's expression softened into something resembling weary recognition. "I remember this paper. I signed it. I am Father Laurent." Leo stopped breathing. Clara stepped closer, her shoulder brushing against his arm, a silent anchor. "Where is he?" Leo asked, the words barely pushing past his throat. "He is not here," Father Laurent replied gently, handing the paper back. "We are an orphanage, monsieur. We do not keep the children forever. We find them homes." "Who took him?" "A local family," the priest explained, leaning heavily on the wooden broom handle. "A boat builder and his wife. They were good people, hard-working. They could not have children of their own. They took the boy in when he was 5. They named him Luc." "I need an address," Leo demanded, the Mafia boss beginning to bleed through his desperate exterior. Father Laurent studied Leo for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the expensive watch on Leo's wrist, the faint white scar on his jaw, the hard, uncompromising set of his shoulders. Then he looked at Clara, noting the way she stood guard beside him. "He works at the old shipyard on the South Docks," Father Laurent finally said, pointing toward the sprawling harbour below. "Dubois Marine. You will find him there." They drove down the winding coastal road in absolute silence. The ocean glittered to their right, a vast expanse of brilliant turquoise. Leo's grip on the steering wheel turned his knuckles white. The ghost he had chased for 2 decades was suddenly flesh and blood, living just a few miles away. Dubois Marine was a dusty, chaotic boatyard filled with half-finished wooden hulls, stacks of fiberglass, and the sharp screech of power saws. Leo parked the Peugeot across the street in the shadow of a rusted crane. They didn't get out of the car. Leo rolled down the window. The smell of sawdust and marine varnish flooded the cabin. About 50 yards away, a man in his mid-20s was standing on the deck of a dry-docked fishing boat. He wore faded denim overalls and a white t-shirt stained with engine grease. He was laughing, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, talking animatedly to an older man holding a clipboard. Even from this distance, the resemblance was undeniable. He had the same dark hair, the same broad shoulders, but there was no tension in his frame. There was no paranoia in his eyes. He looked entirely at peace. A young woman walked out of the shipyard office, carrying a small, babbling toddler on her hip. The man on the boat dropped his wrench, vaulted over the side of the hull, and jogged over to them. He kissed the woman, took the toddler, and tossed the child into the air, catching him with a booming, joyful laugh that echoed across the yard. Clara watched the scene, then turned to look at Leo. Leo was perfectly still. A single, silent tear broke the surface of his slate-grey eyes, cutting a clean track down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was the release of a 20-year burden. He had saved him. The boy hadn't just survived the fire. He had survived the life. He was a boat builder, a father, a husband. He didn't know the crushing weight of the Rossi name, the paranoia of the crosshairs, or the blood required to hold an empire. Leo slowly rolled the window up, sealing out the sounds of the shipyard. "Do you want to talk to him?" Clara asked softly, her voice barely louder than the hum of the engine. Leo stared through the tinted glass for one last, agonizing minute. He memorized the shape of his brother's smile. Then he reached for the ignition. "No," Leo said. His voice was thick, but it was absolutely certain. Gabriel Rossi died in fire 20 years ago. Luc Dubois is a good man with a good life. Bringing him back from the dead would only drag him into hell. He shifted the car into drive. Clara reached across the center console and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, her grip firm and unyielding. Leo turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. He squeezed tightly, anchoring himself to the woman who had walked into an empty church and completely rebuilt his world. They drove away from the harbor, leaving the ghost in the sun, and headed back to the empire they had conquered together. In a world governed by violence and vengeance, true power sometimes lies in the quietest sacrifices. Leo and Clara's journey proves that the strongest bonds are often forged in the fires of chaos, and that keeping someone safe sometimes means letting them go forever. What did you think of Leo's final, heartbreaking decision at the shipyard? Did Clara prove herself to be the ultimate Mafia queen? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark, strategic romance, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more intense audio stories.